In our journey together, we've looked at some overarching and grand ideas about the meaning of life, and if we look back on them, they're fairly complicated and complex. But recently, it's as if maybe the way these ideas have spun out through philosophy, we've reached a kind of dead end and become dead-ended. Now, there might be some agonies that we have over the meaning of life, but unlike Schopenhauer, I don't think life is to us such a burden that we want simply not to think any longer about its meaning and hope that life doesn't last too long. And even though many of us work 9 to 5, or maybe from 6 in the morning until midnight, and don't necessarily find the world in which we work one that meets our talents, at the same time, I doubt we contemplate revolution. I think our view is that we will find time to pursue questions of meaning, maybe even more so if we have the opportunity to retire. But in any case, we are making a turn now of a significant nature because the overarching pictures that we have seen in our previous lectures are pictures of a grander world, or even in Marx, the world at large that might be changed. With Kierkegaard, and Søren Kierkegaard is a Danish philosopher who lives in the first half of the 19th century, the emphasis is on the individual. Kierkegaard is what is called an existentialist, and his concern is to help us see that we must become individuals. We're not simply individuals to begin with. Before Kierkegaard, the notion of detaching from one's specific individuality and coming to relate and even belong to something larger than oneself had dominated much philosophical thinking regarding the best way to live. And a most fundamental means of accomplishing this kind of transcendence of our ordinary life was thought to be through the deployment of maybe a detached reason or maybe a passionate reason. And typically what this suggested was that we did have a lower and a higher nature, and that we could somehow dispense with or at least make less strong that lower nature, and that that higher nature of ours, our true and essential nature, probably connected with our human reason, could then lift us, and in lifting us, help us find that higher level where meaning could be discovered. Actually, in the Greeks, the idea was that if we could detach and transcend in this way, and we did find something that was of lasting value, that probably meant that there was something of lasting value in us. What it suggested was that, well, only like can know like, and that if truth is eternal and we can know it, well, maybe there's something eternal or immortal about us, and that our rational capacity to seek this out shows that we have a genuine dignity. At a minimum, even if our life ends with death and we would never be again, there's still a notion of a kind of objective immortality, that though we die, we can at least have known what matters, that there are things that matter that will always be, and we can know them. And of course, in the history of philosophical thinking, there have been great struggles. Great struggles have been involved in subduing our lower nature and in developing our higher nature and giving it a chance to develop. Agonizing concerns in philosophy and in religion. Through Augustine, the idea that one's sensual nature is a great stumbling block, as it was seen to be by many people after Socrates in a Greek world where things were falling apart. And we've seen very clearly that the passions were believed to be directed toward the transitory, the unimportant, and that we'd have to rise above that. Now, the form that the quest for transcendence of our lower nature took in Kierkegaard's time turned out to be quite historical. What was sought was a comprehension of some kind of blueprint of history itself. And it didn't matter whether one actually contributed personally to history, or historical development, but one could at least understand it. And Kierkegaard, living in Copenhagen, Denmark, read and reflected on a number of thinkers who we call Danish Hegelians. And unlike Hegel's view of the vast sweep of history, of the development of the Western spirit, the Danish Hegelians talked about the dialectical development of Denmark and the history of this and the history of that. And Kierkegaard thought that was just absurd. These were probably, in the worst sense, academics who'd read some Hegel and thought, well, Hegel had said all these things, but here we in Denmark, we can talk about things too. Now, they didn't do this, but it's as if they said, let us give the history of the stages of the dialectical development of Danish pastry. Kierkegaard thought they were just into trivialities, but very, very pompously so. So, in a famous passage of Kierkegaard's, he talks about himself. And what he says in this passage is that, well, he's sitting at a sidewalk cafe, and he's thinking about the fact that everybody's making life easier. And he's thinking of the Danish Hegelians that make it easier, so to speak, to understand the development of this, the development of that, even as I suggested, but of course I don't fully mean it, Danish pastry. And what Kierkegaard says is, I want to be famous and important too. So what I'm going to do is try to find a way to make things more difficult. And he says at that point, the cigar that he was smoking went out, and he had to take a moment to light it. He says this because he's going to begin to get us to think that the small, the trivial, the seemingly unimportant, the incidental things in life, well, they kind of matter too. And these pompous academic philosophers with these abstract concepts who don't pay full attention to the close little details of life, well, they're fundamentally missing something that's very important. Because as human beings like you and like me, all kinds of things enter into our lives and even contribute to the meaning of our lives. And we need to pay attention to them. We need to pay a great attention to them. Kierkegaard thinks that meaning in life is found through living through very specific, concrete, and individual situations that don't necessarily have any overall rationality. If we could paraphrase a notion, he says, the crowds might fill the plaza full, but probably there's only one there that knows the truth, and that's the one that fights the bull. Kierkegaard has diatribes about the press, which he claims is always throwing out this and that, and in throwing out this and that, getting us caught up in conventional ideas, not thinking things through for ourselves. And if we're not up with the press, maybe we're reading these fancy history books, not history of life, but history of dialectical ideas. And for him, that's not where life is going to be found. Actually, Kierkegaard's existentialism, as it's called, is captured in some very specific circumstances that he details in a book called Fear and Trembling. And it's based on the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac. Kierkegaard tells this story in a very moving, if philosophers can be moving, way. Abraham is asked to sacrifice his son Isaac, and he takes his son Isaac up to be sacrificed. Kierkegaard talks about this under a concept that he calls the teleological suspension of the ethical. What does he mean by that? Well, it should come as no surprise that he claims that there could morally be no justification that you would take the life of your son. That it is absolutely morally wrong to do so, and would not take a great deal of insight to see that. However, Kierkegaard broods on the fact that God has commanded Abraham to make this sacrifice. And here we come to the core point. Kierkegaard says that because God has commanded it, Abraham must do it, but it doesn't, in any sense we can comprehend, make it morally right that it is done. It is justified for a higher reason, and that higher reason is precisely that it has been God's command that that be done. When Kierkegaard talks this way, what he's trying to do, among other things, is undercut an idea we've seen in Hegel, that there's the moral plane of life and there's the creative plane, and that great people are not always morally good people, but some of the great creators of the world nonetheless do things that are immoral or amoral and cause suffering for others. But if the creative spirit lives through them and they contribute something further to the human spirit, well, so be it, and that's fine. When Kierkegaard talks about Abraham and Isaac, Kierkegaard wants us to think that there could only be one reason to transcend the moral, and that would be a command by God. Now, that's an extreme case, but such a case for Kierkegaard, that case that he dwells on so much, is essential, and in its essence, it defines a crisis situation for human beings in human life. And these crisis situations, on his view, are neither rational, they're not articulatable and communicable in any easy way to other people, but they're very concrete situations, and out of them, our lives become what they truly are. Now, this is not just a story about Abraham. This is also, it turns out, a story about Kierkegaard. As we move forward now in a way that we didn't before, we're going to be looking a little at the lives of some of these philosophers who are talking to us about the meaning of life. We didn't say much about Kant's life. We didn't say much about Hegel's life. We didn't say much about Schopenhauer's life, about Marx's life. But to understand Kierkegaard, who's called the father of existentialism, we have to look a little bit at his life, because he thinks the Abraham and Isaac story, which he tells, that illustrates that only God's command would justify our transcending the realm of the moral, he thinks that there was an exemplification of that in his own personal life. Now, some will think, and it's quite easy to think, I believe, in our time, that not much should be made of this. But we have to keep closely in mind that this is the Kierkegaard of the 1840s in Copenhagen. And Kierkegaard breaks an engagement that he has with a woman named Regina Olsen. She's much younger than he, and he claims he's doing it in order to spare her. He's going to be sparing her from something. Her father comes over, virtually begs Kierkegaard to keep the engagement on. The girl, Regina, is distraught. Kierkegaard is in anguish over doing this. But he tells Regina that he, Kierkegaard, has melancholy, and that he couldn't subject over a lifetime in marriage, and marriages really did tend to last until death at this time. He was afraid that the melancholy that would be inflicted on Regina would be too much for her. But he also said in his writings that writing about her was more enjoyable than being with her. But there's a third thing that comes through in his writings, and that is that as Abraham was asked to sacrifice Isaac, and that for a special relationship with God, it is as if Kierkegaard believes that Kierkegaard has to sacrifice Regina Olsen in order to have a complete and full relationship with God. Kierkegaard thinks Kierkegaard's relationship with God must not be diluted. And of course, as we know, let's pause and think about this for a moment. It worked out for Abraham, didn't it? Because after all, there was an alternate sacrifice provided, and Abraham, at the last minute, didn't have to sacrifice his son. However, on Kierkegaard's view of his own experience, Kierkegaard had to follow through and could not reclaim Regina, could not revoke his breaking of the engagement. He had to give her up. He had to give her up. Why? Because Kierkegaard had come to believe that a wholehearted, single-minded, undistracted commitment, a leap of faith in which the one and only intimate relationship you had was with God, that would be the only full life. Only in that intense personal relationship with God would any meaning of life be found. And that would give one a pure heart, and only by developing a pure heart would that relationship be possible. So if Hegel says we can spectatorially re-experience a narrative about history, if Marx says, oh, there has to be a revolution so the world we live in meets our needs and allows us to express our talents, if Kant talks about a moral life in which our duty is always fighting against our inclinations, Kierkegaard tells us that the true meaning of our lives is within us and inward, largely, if not completely hidden, and no one else can truly know it, touch it, understand it. And that inner life itself only finally makes sense if it is a relationship with God. And in this respect, Kierkegaard is a very Christian thinker. Kierkegaard understands himself to be a Christian. And so the relationship he thinks that has to exist with God is on Christian terms. He makes a very, very important distinction between, well, what could be called a knight of faith. Think of someone with armor riding on a horse in the Middle Ages. And another kind of knight, think of him also as kind of with armor and riding on a horse, a knight of resignation. So we have knight of faith, knight of resignation. He has troubles with people who he calls knights of resignation because he thinks they call attention to themselves. Let's think of them as those who display their religion. They want you to know they're religious. They may be directly part of very organized religion. They may display their humility, their poverty. They may even go in particular garbs. And Kierkegaard says those resigned people who resign themselves from ordinary pleasures in life, what they're really doing is calling attention to themselves. The knight of faith, again, we have this person in armor, a medieval warrior, except for Kierkegaard, it's somebody in Denmark in the middle of the 19th century. The knight of faith's faith is inward, unseen. You meet this person, but you don't know that this is a knight of faith. You don't know that this is a knight of faith at all. You just see someone, and you can never read from their external appearance what they are really like. But Kierkegaard's intense claim is that only a religion hidden, only known to you, in which it is all about your very personal relationship to God, that you don't display to anyone else, is a way through which you can actually find and be one with the meaning of life. There's another crisis in Kierkegaard's life which I think it underlies and explains why he thought that separateness and isolation from others was a very essential thing. The relationship to God was to be the primary relationship, but Kierkegaard has an account of relations with others as well that tells us that we must be sure not to be connected with others in any significant way. We must find opportunities to keep separation. There was a satirical journal in Copenhagen. It was called The Corsair. It satirized people, but it ignored Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard challenges it to satirize him, and finally it does. And in a way, this is a sad story because the satire was biting. The satire was cruel. And as a consequence, there would be pictures of Kierkegaard that appeared in the Danish newspapers with his hunchback. He was a hunchback walking through Copenhagen. And it's in fact the case that little boys in Copenhagen, recognizing Kierkegaard, would throw stones at him. But you see, someone would say, that's terrible. Not Kierkegaard. He thought he forced a situation in which even if he wanted connection with others, it was made difficult. And that's because when it came down to it, Kierkegaard believed that security, the reassurance you get through life with others, it's a kind of death. It is the sort of thing that anesthetizes you. What we do, he thinks, so often is put on faces to meet the faces that we meet. What we probably have is an inner agony. And if we are finding the religious, if we can find it, it can only be through cultivating in secrecy and in inwardness that agony. Kierkegaard had a peculiar relation to the Church of Denmark, and that became another defining crisis in his life. A bishop of the Church of Denmark died. His name was Jacob Münster, and a eulogy was given for him by a professor named Martensen. And Martensen said that Münster, the bishop, was just another in a long line of witnesses to the truth. Well, Kierkegaard was outraged and started writing articles saying, is this a witness? Is this the truth? Is there some long chain? That's a mockery. Why does he say this? He says it because he thinks you can relate to God, I can relate to God, but there are no linkages that can relate us to God through the historical development of something like a church. It can't be done that way. What he says in some of his writings is a person living at the same time as Jesus. And remember, Hegel thought he was a Christian. Kierkegaard thought he was a Christian. For Kierkegaard, as a Christian, even if you walked next to Jesus and lived then, you were no closer to Jesus than you would be believing in Jesus for Kierkegaard in the 19th century for us now. So the notion of historical tradition of the church, Kierkegaard thought was a mockery. Only individuals could know God. Unlike Hegel, Kierkegaard believes that institutional settings falsely hijack the soul, and they give us a false sense of reassurance. They don't enhance our being, our soul, and the true quest for and discovery of meaning in life. And he has a funny story to tell about this. He says if you really believed in the church and you really believe the doctrine you had to be baptized to be saved, well, would you take anybody else's word for it? Wouldn't you go and make sure it had happened? Maybe your parents were confused that day and you weren't actually baptized. This talk about these beliefs and that, oh, we're baptized and now we're part of the church and we're saved, Kierkegaard said, get serious. If you really believe that stuff, would you take it on faith? If your mother or father, your guardian said, oh, we took care of those things. We know you have to be baptized to be saved. Don't worry, we did it. Well, wouldn't you worry if we weren't just talking about whether we got tickets for a baseball game, but whether something was done, baptism that was necessary for our eternal salvation? Kierkegaard thinks that true spiritual relatedness is necessary for salvation. But for him, it's not attainable by any visible means. And in fact, and this is something that we need to dwell on, Kierkegaard thinks that the Christianity that he thinks is the way to the meaning of life, the Christianity he thinks that only comes to individuals, you, me, every single individual, that Christianity which Kierkegaard takes to be true, he says, is offensive to our human reason. Bluntly put, Kierkegaard's claim is that if you think that the reason you believe in Christianity is because it makes sense, you've misunderstood Christianity. On Kierkegaard's account, even to reach the point where a true spiritual commitment can be made, you need to go through prior stages. You have to live through, in fact, 3 of them. And in our next lecture, we're going to be talking about those stages that we go through. However, it's important to note that for Kierkegaard, reason must be used to its fullest in order for us to experience that finally reason won't get us there. And in fact, we must use reason to its fullest in order to discover that where we're going to find the meaning of life from a rational standpoint doesn't make sense. Think of the contrast. Hegel has said, history is the development of the spirit. It is the narrative story of God's consciousness. And we can give a rational account of that story. Kierkegaard says, oh yes, we must use our reason, but we must use our reason only to reflect on ourselves and our own situation, and we, at the end of the full use of our reason, must experience that our reason finally doesn't work. He's not in this sense a mushy irrationalist. He says that someone can discover that reason won't do the job only after the thorough and complete use of it. But again, that use is in a set of reflections regarding oneself. And the problem is to find a way in the midst of this and this reflection on oneself to realize that one somehow isn't, but must become an individual. Unlike secular existentialism, an existentialism having nothing to do with religion, Kierkegaard believes that our true nature, something that's yet to be developed by most people, for it to exist and to be fully reached, there has to be a very specific relationship to God. Now, as a guide to living, Kierkegaard does use philosophy. He uses it to mock Hegel, mock the Danish Hegelians. He uses philosophy rigorously to show that that kind of thinking, rational thinking, well, it's fancy, it's intricate, but when it comes down to it, it's not altogether relevant. And it doesn't help us as individuals, even before we become religious, in the intensely personal aspects of our lives. Well, in our next lecture together, we have to look to see how it is that Kierkegaard tells us we can go through stages and arrive at this religious life which he claims is the true meaning of life.